Griff with part 6 of my series, Ecclesiology for Sedevacantism, based on Dogmatic Theology, Volume 2, Christ Church, by Msgr G. Van Noort. I continue where I left off, page 11, Scholion 3. The distinction between the primitive church and the synagogue. From the fact that Christ, during his earthly sojourn, and the disciples, even after Pentecost, observed the ceremonial prescriptions of the Mosaic law, some have concluded that the Christians in the early days after Pentecost did not form a society distinct from the synagogue, and that consequently the church had not been founded by Christ himself. The principal objection of these adversaries has already been met above. For since the Christians, immediately after Pentecost, professed their own special doctrine, performed rites peculiar to themselves, obeyed their own leaders, it is clear that they did indeed make up a society distinct from the synagogue. One further point, they also held their own assemblies. As for the observance of the ceremonial legal precepts, the fact that Christ and the apostles during his lifetime kept the law presents no difficulty. For all the observances of the old law remained alive or obligatory up to the death of Christ, who at that time established the new covenant in his own blood. With our Lord's death, the Old Testament went out of existence, and from that moment the precepts of the law became dead, i.e., no longer of obligation. Nevertheless, the apostles and the first converts from Judaism kept the legal prescriptions for a while, and this was a prudent arrangement, for it showed more clearly the connection between the two testaments and gave the defunct synagogue a decent burial, much like that of a cherished mother whose lifeless corpse is not tossed hurriedly into a ditch, but kept for a while and then borne reverently to the grave by a massed crowd of sons and daughters. But later, when the gospel had been sufficiently promulgated, the ceremonial precepts of the law became positively lethal, in the sense that they could no longer be carried out by Catholics without serious sin. So that's pretty strong stuff. We really couldn't continue the things of the law as such. I think what they mean is as such. In other words, you're doing this to keep kosher. Well, no, that's sinful. But if you just happen to, like what also happens to be kosher, and that's just what you eat, I don't see that that's a sin. But you see what I mean? You're not keeping the law as a law. It doesn't exist anywhere. It doesn't have force. And of course, that's very evidenced also by the fact that how much of the law can't you keep without a theocratic state of Israel, without a temple, without even an identifiable, Kohen priesthood to offer the sacrifices, Levitical, priesthood. So clearly that law has had its day, and its only possible existence today is as it is subsumed into the Christian church. Proposition 2. It is due to the institution of Christ himself that the church is visible. This proposition is certain. That the church is visible follows necessarily from the fact that it is a real society, for there can be no genuine society in the world of men unless it be visible. But since Protestants constantly attack with might and main the visible character of the church which Christ founded, it is necessary to give the question special consideration. The visible form of the church, which is the subject of this present discussion, must not be confused with what is strictly its knowability. It is one thing to ask whether the church which Christ founded is a public society. It is quite another, to ask whether that society can be recognized as the true church of Christ by certain distinguishing marks. Its being formally recognizable presupposes its being visible, but the two are not identical. Furthermore, the present discussion centers on the visible character of the church insofar as it is a society. No one denies that the church's members are visible, for they are flesh and blood people. But some do question whether, by the institution of Christ himself, these members are bound together by external bonds so as to form a society that can be perceived by the senses, a society of such a nature that one can readily discern who belongs to it and who does not. Mark well the words, the institution of Christ himself. For the question is precisely this: did Christ personally found a visible church, one by which its very nature would have to be an external public society, so that an invisible church could not possibly be the true church of Christ? For once one proves that the one and only church which Christ founded is visible from its very nature, then it necessarily follows, A, that an invisible church, such as that to which the Protestants appeal, is a pure fiction, and B, that all the promises which Christ made to his church refer to a visible church. Note lastly that to insist on the church's being visible is not to claim that all of its elements are immediately apparent to the senses. Just as a man is readily visible even though one cannot see his soul directly, so too the church must be adjudged truly visible even if some element which is an essential part of its makeup cannot be seen directly, provided that this element be by its very nature joined to and externally manifested by some visible element. Proof. Well, we'll continue this in the next part.